Welcome to Tool Talk Episode 12. This is the official podcast for Jonard Tools. Today we have Ed Sorbona, Senior Director of Engineering, and Wayne Bunce, National Sales Director for North America for Jonard Tools. Today, our special guest is Chuck Bowser. Chuck is the host of Let's Talk Cabling podcast. Let me tell you a little bit about Chuck. Chuck Bowser, RCDD. Tech has 40 plus years of installation, design, estimation, and project management skills in the ICT industry. He leverages his knowledge to help educate, encourage, and enrich the lives of fellow peers. As an instructor and host of Let's Talk Cabling podcast and vlog, he brings weekly content across all social media platforms in a manner that everyone can relate to. And I think that is awesome. So welcome, Chuck.
Thank you. I've never been called special before. I feel honored.
Well, we think you are special. How's that?
So he is special because the RCDD on his shirt that we can see, I actually started that like 20 some years ago, and I got like 2 days into it and I stopped doing it. So, but
it's definitely to be an RCDD in general and pass all those classes and get certified is an accomplishment. It's right in the cabling installation networking world. It's like the equivalent of being a professional engineer. Okay, it carries big clout.
I don't know if I'd put it on the same level as professional engineer, but there's certainly a worldwide recognition for RCDD. And the first question on the exam is, how do you spell RCDD? If you can't get past that, then you can't get the certification.
That must be the question that got me in.
Yeah, my whole point with that was it carries a lot of clout in the end, and not everyone can get through it. I know guys that have tried 3 times and finally gave up and said, I've tried 3 times, I haven't passed the test, so I'm good where I'm at. And still, it's an accomplishment, and it's great that you go after something like that. So
yeah, just expand on that. So right now I'm in the middle of my second TDMM study group. So once a year I do a TDMM study group. It's free. I don't charge anybody for it. And I create a group, I put it there and people sign up. And at the beginning, I always have, like, for example, this one that I'm currently about halfway through right now, we had 50 people sign up for the study group. And there's some things that we got to read a certain amount of pages every week, and you got to submit questions, and then we meet together for an hour virtually on a conference call. I answer their questions. Sometimes I bring on subject matter experts because nobody can know everything about our industry. So I'll bring on subject matter experts and stuff. And usually after about the 3rd week, the attendance starts dropping off because it's not easy. Especially the first couple chapters, principles of transmission. That's a hard subject. And usually by the end of the class, you've boiled out the people who thought it was a cool idea. Yeah, I want to go get that RCDD. And then when the rubber hits the road and they find out the stuff that they got to know and learn and stuff, and realize, well, maybe I might need to do this next year because I got a brand new baby this year, or whatever reason they have in their life. It's definitely not an easy certification to get, but I'll tell you what, it has shifted my career into high gear. Once I got mine, I started making more money. I started getting job offers. If anybody's thinking about getting the RCDD who qualifies for it, absolutely, I recommend go get it.
There you go. Great. That's great. So I'm glad we took that little sidetrack there. The reason we brought Chuck on today is we wanted to talk about and find out more about TIA EIA 568A B. Where the heck did this come from? Why did it come about? And why is this, why these 2 different color schemes for something, and honestly don't make a darn bit of difference. Color is orange or blue or black or yellow or lavender, whatever. But there's this little switch going on here. So I want to find out a little bit about the history of it, and then maybe I'm wrong, and I'm certainly no expert, but it has no bearing on anything at the end of the day. My opinion is that, and I want to know if I'm correct in that, and if I'm wrong, I'd like to understand why I'm wrong. So with that, fire away,
Wow. Okay. Well,
Chuck.
so you called me on my lunch break, so we only have an hour. So we really probably should have scheduled 3 or 4 hours for this conversation.
The Reader's Digest version will do.
Oh, and before we get too further along, I went to the Low Voltage Nation meetup in Jacksonville, Florida, and I met Ricky.
Oh,
Yay, Ricky.
fantastic.
And so I gave Ricky some presents for you guys. So make sure you get them from Ricky. Make sure he doesn't keep them.
Excellent. What we'll do, I'll bother him after we're done with this.
Nice guy. I like him a lot. So
I'm gonna check his eBay store.
I'm sorry.
I'm gonna check Ricky's eBay store real quick.
So let's first talk about wiring schemes in general. Why is there even a wiring scheme, right? So wiring schemes have been around for decades, and they really were predominantly made by AT&T, because when you think about AT&T, AT&T was a nationwide utility provider. So they had customers in Buffalo, New York, and Tampa, Florida, and Las Vegas. So they had thousands and thousands and thousands of technicians. Well, they didn't want every technician wiring up a jack their own way. They wanted to have a standard, so that way, if they had to fly a technician from Tampa to New York, the people in New York wired the jacks up the exact same ways they do in Tampa. So they had to create that standardization. But the first one wasn't T568A or T568B. The first one was actually USOC, USOC, Universal Service Order Code. And so that was actually designed, and there's different USOC wiring schemes depending on the applications, but that's the basis for what we have now, right? The T568B, when you look at the history of that, it actually started out as the 258A wiring scheme that AT&T used to have for their Merlin phone systems. So it varied from the USOC and where the colors actually show up in the pins. By the way, it does matter where those colors show up on those pins. Now, it's not so much that the color, but the pins and the pair assignments are designed to work with each other. So you can't just wire it white, blue on one side and work your way through the other side, because you're gonna have split pairs and you're gonna get all kinds of weird test results. But the 250A ended up becoming the 568B, because what happened is there was another small little company called Nortel, and Nortel had a phone system called a Meridian phone system. So both the Meridian and AT&T's phone system both all use 4-pair. Meridian couldn't duplicate the pin scheme that AT&T had in the US because AT&T had it patented. So they had to get around the patent. So they flipped to the pairs, right? So that's why there's an A and a B. So when they wrote the standards in the 90s, so that way, same principle, there's thousands of technicians out there. We want everybody terminating the exact same way. So they got the standard together, and when standards are created, they invite subject matter experts from manufacturing, end users, contractors, so that way we get a well-rounded view for as far as the standard. So Meridian's on that committee, so is AT&T. So they both got their wiring schemes put into the standards. When you look at the wiring schemes, can you compare them as far as performance? They're almost equal to each other. Now, I did do a bench test one time. I took a 100-foot piece of cable and I terminated 568B and I put my tester on it, my AM Test Pro, and I tested it and I cut off the ends and then I re-terminated it with the other wiring scheme, tested it. A did perform slightly better, but not enough to make a difference impact for network performance. So they both perform equally well. So in the US, the standards tells us we can use T568A and T568B. When you start talking about residential wiring, the standards recommend you use the A, not the B. And the reason for that is because the T568A wiring scheme, the blue and the orange pairs line up with the blue and the orange on the USOC wiring schemes. And that's important because there's millions of houses out there in the US and even probably outside the US that were wired up 10, 20, 30 years ago using the USOC wiring scheme. So if you use the 568A wiring scheme, you can still have 2-line phone sets in your residential houses. But just kind of show the way that our industry is going is, who has a landline anymore? I don't have a landline. I got 2 cell phones. We don't, Nobody has landlines anymore. And here's a trivia fact most people don't know. Do you know why they call it T568A and T568B?
No idea.
No, sir.
Yeah. So there was, when they came up with the first set of standards, right, the 568.A standard, people were getting the standard confused with the wiring schemes. So they put T in front of the wiring scheme. So when you say T568A, they knew you were talking about the wiring scheme, not the whole standard. That's why. And then now we're in, I think, what, the D series standard? I think 568.D, I think now. So it doesn't really apply anymore, but that's where the T came from. It's T568A and T568B. And so it's a pretty cool story, but not many people, you want to start an argument on the internet, ask people which is better, A or B, and you will get a plethora of comments.
So
this podcast, my hunch will create that already. So
just to go back, you're talking about it's more important about the pin placements, not the color code.
Yeah, I'm glad you point that out, because I point this out in my classes all the time. So when you do it, I just happen to have a jack sitting on my desk. Imagine that. So pin 1 is all the way over here on the left. Right. Pin 8 all the way over on the right, right? So when the tester's testing it, it's testing it by the pin number. It puts a signal on pin 1, and it looks for that signal coming on pin 1 on the other side. It's looking to make sure there's no opens, no shorts, no reversals, no transposals, right? So then it report back if there's a open on pin 4, right? Well, most technicians are gonna think, well, 4, that's the brown pair. No, pin 1, the blue pair is pins 4 and 5 on both wiring schemes. So the tester talks to you in pin numbers, but generally, as technicians, we think in pair numbers. Now, like I said earlier, you can't just wire them straight across. They got to be within the pairs that they were signed with the pins. Otherwise, you'll start getting some really weird. I did a really cool episode, I want to say 3 months ago or so, where I did 568A versus 568B, and I brought Steve Cowles from AEM on, and I said to him, I sent him 2 test results, and I say, tell me which one's better. I didn't tell him what the difference was, and he looked at him and he goes, well, this one performs a little bit better, and then I told him, well, the only thing that changes, one's wired A and one's wired B. And then on that same show, I also sent one where I wired it white, blue on the left, and then worked my way to the brown, white on the right-hand side. Like most people say, it's just straight through, it'll work. That test result was all whacked out of order. It would not have passed anything at all. So you do have to pay attention to the assignments. Now, it used to be that you had to make sure that you had both, either A on both sides or B on both sides, unless you're making like a crossover cable. A crossover cable is where they swap the blue and the orange pair so that the transmit and receives will talk to each other. But in today's network equipment, most of the stuff's auto-negotiating, and they figure it out by themselves. So the key is pick one that you like, and use it all the time, unless the customer tells you to do otherwise. And you're going to find 99.999% of the time, at least in the US, they're going to tell you B. The federal government likes A, some school districts like A, there's some financial districts that like A. There's no performance advantage to it. There's none whatsoever.
No, that's great to know.
So I was also curious, which pins are used for what? Because I told you I was an entry-level RCDD, like video, voice, but some pins aren't even used. Explain that, because that was always a mystery to me as well.
So as far as the RCD exam is concerned, they're not going to ask you which color shows up on which pins, because it doesn't, that's not the TDM doesn't get down to that grade level. What they will ask you is maybe something like, if you use A on one side, I can use B on the other side. That they might ask you that, but they're not going to ask you what pins show up exactly on which colors show up on which pins. But there is a sequence to it. Now, what probably is confusing you is some networks use 2 pair, some networks use 4 pair, right? So, for example, the 1 gigabit network, or the old stuff, like from my old days, the 10 megabit stuff, it only ran off of 2 pairs, and those would show up on pins 1, 2, 3, and 6, right? In today's environment, if you're doing 40 gig over copper, you're using all 4 pairs, all 8 pins. That's why it's critical to make sure that you maintain the wiring scheme, and you also critical that you don't untwist too much of the pairs when you're terminating the jack. You want that. Now the standard has different numbers that you should follow, like a 1/2 inch untwist for Cat 5e or 6, or 1/4 of an inch for Cat 6a. But as a technician out in the field, the only thing you need to know is when you're terminating that jack, just make sure that I don't have a piece of cable sitting. Oh yeah, I do have a piece of cable sitting on my desk. Look at that, cable and connectors. All right, you just want to make sure that jacket comes all the way up to the very back of that connector. If you do that, you will be well within those numbers. Well within those numbers. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Because if you ask me what color show up and what pins, I'd actually have to whip out my reference card, which I don't have in front of me at the moment because I haven't crimped a mod end connector in a while.
So I actually have two more questions.
Fire away.
So is there an acronym, like, I don't know if I'm saying, like, is there a way to remember the color codes? Is there like a saying out there that we can tell people, like for A, it's, green, orange?
I've never heard of a color. I've never heard of a mnemonic saying for the wiring schemes. I've heard of mnemonic sayings for the color code,
yes,
but not specifically for the T568 or T568B. I'd be interested in knowing that one too. So if any of your audience members knows of one, yeah, make sure you post in the comments because I want to learn from that.
There you go. Yeah, that's it. That is a good question.
Yeah, but as far as the color code, right? So you have your tip and your ring colors, right?
Right.
And there's mnemonic sayings that we have out there memorized those, and some of those are okay, and some of them are not politically correct. Let's just leave it at that.
Okay, they lean a little bit towards the salty side. So okay.
They do. Like, so for example, when I was taught my color code, I was a technician in the DC area. I was taught, you have white, red, black, yellow, violet, right? So I was taught Washington Redskins bring you victory. Well, A, you can't call them the Redskins anymore, and no, they never did bring you a victory, right? But there's lots of them out there, and I could quote 2 or 3 for both the tip and the ring conductors. That's from being in the industry too long, unfortunately.
Right.
What's your other question?
And this is a question that was asked me recently. So a lot of guys are going through and outfitting everything from Cat 5 to Cat 6. And I get asked all the time if our Cat 6A connectors will work with a Cat 5 cable. And to this date, I've only tested it once, and it was a little sloppy on our, like you said about getting the insulation all the way into the modular plug. What's your thoughts on that?
You're only going to be as good as your weakest link. So if you run Cat 5e cable, by the way, we don't run Cat 5 anymore. We haven't run Cat 5 in 15 years.
We're talking about people going into the homes that have Cat 5.
Yeah. So if you run a Cat 5e cable and you put a Cat 6 connector on it, you still got a 5e cable because that's the maximum bandwidth that cable can do, right? It should match because the performance ratings are designed for a reason, but you're only going to be as good as your weakest link. So if you want a Cat 6A solution, you need to put in Cat 6A cable and a Cat 6A connector on that. Yeah,
100%. And actually, you're going to struggle with Cat 6A on a Cat 6 connector or a Cat 5e. It might not even go in because the jacket ends up being too big to get into the. And then on some of the Cat 6A cables, they are running 23 AWG in them, and then depending on the conductor insulator, they won't even, if you're using a pass-through, which I think all the Cat 6As are pass-through now, you're not getting it through. You're not getting. The reason I know this is we just designed one for a cable manufacturer out there because they had a rather unique cable and all the standard stuff on the market didn't work. So
the outside diameter for Cat 5e cable is generally about 0.18 outside diameter. Cat 6A, when it first came out, it was a pipe. I mean, it was like, I think it was 0.357 was the OD.
0.354. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. You're right there.
But there's some now what they call reduced outside diameter Cat 6A cables. There's one that's got a reduced outside diameter Cat 6A cable that's down to 0.24.
Yeah.
Which is a lot smaller than 0.357, but it's still a little bit bigger than a Cat 5e, but it's getting down there. But you gotta be careful with those reduced outside diameter Cat 6A cables because what they did is they took the spline out of it, so that makes them smaller. So some of those reduced outside diameter Cat 6A cables can only go 70 meters, not 90 meters. So you got to really read the specs if you're trying to go to the reduced outside diameter Cat 6A stuff.
Right, but I don't think
I don't think
there's even 0.354 out there much at all. Everything is certainly smaller than that, and still have the spline inside so that they're maximizing the noise crosstalk and stuff like that. So,
well, see, not all Cat 6A cables has the crossweb separator, right? That's the new thing right now. So some of the manufacturers are finding a way to get 6A performance without the crossweb separator, right? So what really is a limiting factor with Cat 6A is because we're operating up to 500 megahertz, we are very susceptible to EMI, electromagnetic interference. And because of that, they twist the pairs at certain rates to reduce those effects. So for the frequency range that they're going to anticipate to come from, and that's going to be anywhere from 100 megahertz to 500 megahertz. So they'll twist the pairs at different rates. So if you actually pull a 4-pair cable apart and you look at the pairs, each one of those pairs will be twisted at a different rate, so they don't interfere with each other, and so any interference from outside the cable comes into the cable, which is called external interference. It helps dissipate that as well. But there's still, I posted a comment on my TikTok feed on Friday, and my wife had to go to the hospital for gallbladder. So she's laying in this bed. I'm never off the clock. I'm sitting there and watching. She's on her hospital bed, and I look over and I'm looking at the jack on the wall with the patch cord, and the IT guy had tie wrapped it to the electrical cable. So I was like, oh man, I got to record this and put it on TikTok. And so I record and I throw it up on TikTok. Last time I looked, that thing had like 80 comments on it. There's nothing wrong with tie wraps. It's okay to tie wrap to electrical cable. It's probably still working. And I'm like, so I'm going to respond to all those this week. But yeah, so the frequencies that electric uses it's 60 hertz, right? So the 4-pair cable, the twists are really aimed at between 100 and 500, because the way we get rid of EMI from electrical cables is just not run near it. You guys maintain your separation from it.
So. Yep. Oh, okay. Wayne, anything?
Oh, I can keep going, but no, I'm good, because like I said, we can start talking about testing in our next podcast, but that's a whole nother subject.
That sounds like a future show you're going to have me back on with. I told you, if you get me talking about communication cabling, I don't know if an hour will be enough.
Right. I know. I'm watching I'm checking the time, checking my watch, make sure we get you off in time here. So, all right. So why don't we finish this up? I'm going to close out. So we hope this podcast has been informative. Again, we'd like to thank Chuck Bowser, host of Let's Talk Cabling Podcast, for joining us today. We really hope you enjoyed our discussion today, and I hope you join us again in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Chuck, thank you so much. That was
my
great.
pleasure. Anytime.
That was great discussion.
My pleasure.
All right.
Yep.